Today, we are diving into a legal battle that really shook India to its core. We're talking about a massive fight between Parliament and the Supreme Court that all boils down to one simple but incredibly powerful question. Are your fundamental rights permanent, or can they just be erased by the government of the day?
So let's just think about that for a second. Your most basic freedoms, the right to speak your mind, to own property, to be treated as an equal, are those rights really set in stone, like unshakable pillars of our democracy? Or can they be amended, changed, or maybe even completely abolished? This was the explosive question right at the very center of the Golaknath case.
And you know, this whole monumental legal battle, it didn't start in some fancy courtroom or a government office. Nope. It all began on a simple patch of farmland in Punjab with two brothers, Henry and William Golaknath, and their 500 acres.
Okay, so to really get what drove these two brothers to take on the entire government, we need to rewind a bit, back to the early days of independent India. The nation was brand new, full of big dreams, but it was also facing this fundamental clash between the government's grand plans and the rights of its own citizens.
See, on one side, you had the government, which urgently needed to roll out these huge land reforms to deal with economic inequality and, just get the country moving. But on the other side, the brand new constitution explicitly guaranteed citizens the right to property as a fundamental right. It was a classic tug of war from the very beginning.
And in the early rounds of this constitutional tug of war, Parliament seemed to have all the power. They passed amendments to basically shield their laws from the courts. And they won two huge Supreme Court cases, Shankari Prasad and Sajjan Singh, which both said, yep, Parliament can amend any part of the Constitution, even your most sacred fundamental rights. Honestly, it looked like the game was over before it had even really started.
But just when it seemed like Parliament's power was absolute, the Golaknath's family stepped into the ring. They took this abstract legal argument and turned it into a deeply personal fight that would literally change the course of Indian history.
So remember those 500 acres of farmland back in Jalandhar? Well, for the Golaknath brothers, this wasn't just some piece of land. It was their livelihood, it was their property, and it was a right they believed was guaranteed to them by the Constitution itself. But then, a new state law, which was all about redistributing land, threatened to change everything for them. Just like that, the Golaknath family was told they could only keep a tiny fraction of their land, only 30 acres each. The rest, we're talking hundreds of acres, could just be taken by the government.
Well, the family did not back down. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. And their argument was pretty straightforward. This law, and the 17th Amendment that was protecting it, was a direct violation of their sacred, fundamental rights. And so, the stage was set for a massive constitutional showdown.
The Supreme Court knew this wasn't just another case. This was a constitutional earthquake just waiting to happen. So, to hear it, they assembled the largest bench in the court's history up to that point, a full 11 judges. The entire country was holding its breath, knowing a decision was coming that could literally reshape the foundations of their democracy. And the whole thing really boiled down to this epic clash between two powerful articles in the Constitution. You've got Article 368, which gives Parliament the power to amend. But then you've got Article 13, which says that any law that takes away our fundamental rights is totally invalid. So the big question, the million-dollar question, was actually pretty simple. Is a constitutional amendment a law? And when the decision finally came down in 1967, wow, it was a legal bombshell. By the absolute slimmest of margins, just 6-5, the Supreme Court did a complete 180. They yanked back on that constitutional rope with everything they had.
In a pretty stunning reversal of its older rulings, the court declared that our fundamental rights are sacred, they're untouchable, they are completely beyond the reach of Parliament's power to amend. An amendment, the court now said, is a law under Article 13, and because of that, it cannot be used to chip away at our most basic freedoms.
But this, of course, created a huge problem. What about all the amendments that had already been passed that did affect fundamental rights? To avoid total chaos, the court pulled out this pretty clever legal tool from American law. They basically said, okay, our new rule only applies from this day forward. Everything that happened in the past, that stays. But if you thought this was the end of the story, you'd be wrong. The Supreme Court's verdict wasn't a final victory lap. No, it was just the beginning of an even more intense phase of this constitutional conflict. That tug of war, it was far from over. Parliament, feeling like its authority had been completely undermined, was not about to just accept this. In 1971, it fired back with a constitutional cannonball, the 24th Amendment.
And this amendment had one very clear goal: to completely wipe out the Golaknath judgment and reassert Parliament's absolute power to amend any part of the Constitution. No exceptions. So why are we still talking about a case from way back in 1967? Because the Golaknath verdict was a seismic shift in the balance of power in India. It cemented the judiciary's role as the ultimate guardian of the Constitution, and maybe most importantly, it lit the fuse for the next, even more famous legal showdown, the case of Golaknath case. That's the case that would give us the basic structured doctrine, this incredible idea that some parts of the Constitution are so fundamental they can never be changed.
And that brings us right back to where we started. The Golaknath case didn't end the tug-of-war. What it did was frame this essential, ongoing question that every democracy has to grapple with. When it comes to our most fundamental rights, who should have the final say? The elected leaders we put in power, or the unelected judges who interpret the law? It's a question that, India is still debating to this very day.